11 years of war have inflicted immense suffering on the Syrian people. My first experience with Syria was in the mid-80s, but they were only very few childhood memories. Ayatollah Sistani is born in the holy city of Mashhad. And where better to begin the journey in gaining knowledge than in the vicinity of Imam Ali ibn Musa Rada alayhi salam. When the flames of sectarianism were lit by ISIS, he remained calm.
ISIS is not really a threat in Iraq in the same way, and a lot of that is down to his mobilization.
Bomb remained of the utmost importance in his heart. Not only does he study here, but he ends up leaving a legacy behind that will continue to serve generation after generation. It was Ayatollah Sistani who had the huge honor of leading his funeral prayer.
He doesn't need to have a Twitter account. He doesn't need to have a YouTube channel to link himself to his followers.
This meeting with the Pope was a gesture on a completely different level of reality. The Pope himself said, "I have met a man of faith, a man of humility, and a man of God." Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to Thursday Night Live. World Cup 2022 in Qatar has without a doubt been one of the most enthralling World Cups in World Cup history. Certainly one of my favorites, and probably my favorite World Cup since the first World Cup that I ever saw as a 9-year-old, and that was Italia 90. I absolutely loved Italia 90. Italia 90, I'm sure many of us have memories of Paul Gascoigne's tears in the semi-final, England versus Germany. Many of us remember the not-so-classic final between Germany and Argentina, and of course Germany winning that World Cup. But the most interesting thing about Italia 90 was that we fell in love with Italian culture. Many of us did not know much about Italian culture, or we may have read about Italian culture but never witnessed it firsthand. When we therefore saw the tenors and the likes of Pavarotti leaving a legacy behind for all of us in that particular World Cup. Until today, whenever Pavarotti's name is mentioned, whenever his legacy is discussed, we all remember Italia 90. But we also remember the charm of the Italian people, the history of the Italian people, and the culture of the Italian people. Because a World Cup is meant to celebrate humanity at large coming to get to know one another. Hence, all of the World Cups that we've seen since the 1930s have tried to celebrate all of our differences. Some World Cups have been held in America, North and South. Others were held in Europe, as an example. But you saw now that we went towards the Middle East. In Italia 90, we celebrated culture. But when it came to Qatar, the Middle East, and the representation of the religion of Islam, the beginning of this World Cup was so different. The amount of bullying that Qatar faced before this World Cup even took place was phenomenal. It was unbelievable that either we saw a lot of arrogance or we saw a lot of ignorance. That arrogance that may have been discussed by the likes of Said and Orientalism, and that ignorance which had permeated in certain societies about the religion of Islam and about the adherents of the religion. When we came to the beginning of this World Cup, people were questioning whether Qatar was capable of hosting such a World Cup. People were questioning different issues within Qatari society, and in many cases, many of these people had never ever visited Qatar themselves. And that's why two particular ex-football players, and amongst the most famous English football players in history, had a major role to play to try and calm the people down and tell them, look, we've been there, we've discussed it, we can answer all of your fears and indeed your apprehension. One was David Beckham and the other was Gary Neville. David Beckham and Gary Neville are about as proud Brits as you're ever going to see. They're proud of English football. They're proud of their heritage. They're proud of the Western culture as well. But you found that David Beckham was an ambassador for this World Cup. And he was happy to represent Qatar. And he was happy to represent those who had organized this World Cup. David Beckham has hardly put a foot wrong in terms of his reputation. He's loved in British society in many different quarters. He's respected around the world. So when he took on such a position, all of a sudden, David Beckham became the worst person in the world. But why the sudden shift? People began to question David Beckham's motives. How could David Beckham take on such a position? But many of them had not realized that David Beckham himself had gone towards Qatar, had sat with Qatari officials, and if there were issues that he agreed with them on, he was open to discussing them, and areas which he disagreed with them on, they were open to discussing with him. They had no issue whatsoever opening up in many interviews. And that's why Gary Neville took advantage of this by actually going to Qatar and discussing not just the infrastructure and the organization of the Qatari World Cup, but that Gary Neville at the same time was going to ask a number of questions. Gary Neville had already discussed a number of key issues in the lead up to the Qatar World Cup. He had also brought these issues in relation to Saudi Arabia's purchase of Newcastle United Football Club. It's not like Gary Neville was shying away from discussing these issues. So when Gary Neville traveled to Qatar, and on YouTube everyone can see the discussions that he had and the interviews that took place, he asked a lot of pertinent questions. Again, the Qatari organizers were not shying away from taking these questions. Even if you see the Qatari royal family were welcoming all questions regarding their beliefs, regarding their culture, regarding their weather, regarding their architecture, regarding their engineering, and regarding their stadiums. I don't remember any World Cup where the organizers have been questioned as much. There was a World Cup held in Russia. Wasn't that much of an uproar. There were World Cups held in the 80s in countries like Spain. Spain has a certain population that may have a particular racist attitude towards certain colored players. No one mentioned this. Even Italy, for example, still has certain racist tendencies towards certain football players. Ask Mario Balotelli. And yet you still find that no one questioned Italy in 1990. The United States in 1994 may have had certain questionable decisions in the 30 years previous to the World Cup being held in the United States, and again, no one raised any questions. France in 1998, we know that within French society there is a right wing that exists that looks down at people who they feel are immigrants. Again, no one questioned. But why is it that as soon as a Muslim majority country held or organized the World Cup, all of a sudden people continue to question? And for once, Gary Neville's opinion did not matter. Nor did David Beckham's opinion matter at all. Here were two people with the highest reputations who were saying that, listen, we've been there, we've asked the questions, stop questioning people's intentions, let's go on with this World Cup and let's enjoy it. But again, people kept on asking questions. And to me, the saddest situation was the BBC not covering the opening ceremony with the depth that it deserves. I said that Italia 90 and USA 94, France 98, the other World Cups that we've seen being hosted, we all remember opening ceremonies. And we know that opening ceremonies are a must at every single event. We all look forward to an opening ceremony. Sometimes we're baffled as to what's going on in an opening ceremony. Sometimes we're uncertain what's happening. Sometimes it's not even part of our culture. There may be certain things that are being done that are not part of our culture. I can watch certain things and I can, for example, switch the TV onto a different channel. But to completely neglect the opening ceremony and then to turn around and say that that opening ceremony is an opening ceremony that may be shown on one of our other channels is a disgrace. With all due respect to Messrs. Lineker and so on, who I respect highly and who I've grown up not only watching play, not only admiring goals from them, but also at the same time enjoying week in, week out punditry, for you to turn around and take that particular moment from Qatar. Why? Why not let the world appreciate? Morgan Freeman certainly was appreciating. Morgan Freeman went there. He's a Hollywood star. He's someone who's actually dabbled into discussing religion or discussing worldviews or discussing different beliefs around the world centered around God. Morgan Freeman is amongst a number of Hollywood actors who don't mind discussing the beliefs of others. Denzel Washington amongst others. They don't mind playing roles such as Malcolm X. They don't mind opening up and discussing the worldviews of other religions. Morgan Freeman was at the opening ceremony. He didn't shy away. Again, what's the accusation? The accusation is that Freeman's probably just gone for the money. But Freeman's there and he was ready to embrace a culture that probably he didn't know much about. At the same time, the Quran was being recited. That's part of our culture. We adore the Quran and adore the recital of the Quran. But to not cover that part of the culture of a Muslim majority country is very sad. Imagine that that happened to another religion in the world. Imagine, for example, a religion such as Hinduism or Judaism would have been at the receiving end of people who did not want to cover, let's say, for example, a sporting event like the Cricket World Cup in India. And that a whole channel wants to remove everything that's being shown in the name of the idea that we don't agree with some of their policies. You had no problem with the Middle East when they bought Paris Saint-Germain. You had no problem when they were willing to go towards sponsoring Barcelona. You had no issue with Emirates being associated with Arsenal, or the association of Abu Dhabi and Manchester City. At that time, the money was wonderful, and they were bringing success to the likes of Manchester City, and they were bringing Messi to the likes of Paris Saint-Germain, and they were also enthralling the likes of Barcelona and Arsenal. Nobody was talking about how it is that the rights of the workers in those countries should be investigated. I'll come to that shortly. But people were so happy. Emirates, Ittihad, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, and everybody was saying how brilliant this was. Nobody batted an eyelid in 2010 when the sovereign fund of the Qatar royal family decided that they'll buy Harrods from Mohammed al-Fayed. Mohammed al-Fayed probably had more trouble in his own lifetime with Harrods than the Qatari royal family. I don't think the people involved in real estate, when the Qatari royal family had come and purchased Harrods, I don't think they came forward and said, let us go investigate the rights of people in Qatar. On the contrary, they wanted to get that $1 billion deal over the finishing line. At the same time, you find that the Qatari royal family has invested throughout the UK. I don't hear much of a clamor from many of the big property firms or many investment bankers or those who are involved in the world of hedge funds in relation to their purchase. People actually look forward to a Qatari purchasing in Mayfair or a Qatari purchasing in Knightsbridge. They want to sell them those properties. And they want to find out what other areas they can invest with the Qataris. Gas? Oil? Are there other areas in which we can open up our relations? Can we even cause certain wars in the Middle East and all support one another? All of these things, you'll find that the countries that came forward and tried to bully Qatar were the same countries that didn't mind negotiating many different terms with Qatar. And so you found that when this emerged, there were definitely a double standards. A double standards that ironically was picked up by a number of football players and a number of political commentators. Let's not beat around the bush. When a person gives an opinion that there are certain abuses of human rights in Qatar, I agree that there are abuses of human rights that take place in the Middle East. I cannot deny that, because all of us know very well that we may see certain royals from the Middle East who may have the odd Filipino or the odd Pakistani or Bangladeshi servant holding 25 bags for them when they're shopping while they're just walking around. I agree that if you see certain hotels and resorts in Dubai or other parts of the Middle East, that you do see certain people in the middle of, for example, the day, in the middle of the heat, working their socks off. And I agree that there are a number of cases that need to be worked on. I think the Middle East is also coming around to the fact that that's arrogance that some people displayed towards these workers, as if they weren't even human beings, but they were just slaves, and who bats an eyelid if they pass away? That had to change. But the Qataris repeatedly kept stressing, this will change, this is changing. When these things were being raised, there is no doubt that the Qataris had realized that these things needed to be worked on. But there are human rights abuses that also take place from certain Western countries, who, when they're manufacturing clothing, for example, in some of their warehouses around the world, they don't talk about the rights of Pakistanis and Bangladeshis when they're producing in some subhuman conditions. No one talks about how these big designers may have certain factories in India or in Africa where people are working in thousands and no one goes to investigate. But all of a sudden, when a Muslim majority country has the whole world's eyes on it, all of a sudden we should investigate human rights abuses. And if we want to talk about human rights abuses, then I would have preferred if there were certain armbands that were made in honor of abuses towards children in the Middle East. In Yemen, there are children who are starving. Messrs. Kane and the German national team, is there any chance that you could have worn an armband to remember the people of Yemen? Talking of wristbands and armbands, it was about 8 years ago, July 2014, if I'm not mistaken, that Moin Ali was ready to wear a wristband in honor of the people of Gaza. In his worldview, he wanted to have that freedom of speech to remember those who were being bombarded. But then all of a sudden, the ICC and others had an issue. How does freedom of speech work exactly? None of us are too certain about freedom of speech. You go and ask Kanye West, or you go and ask Kyle Irving, or you go and ask others, they'll say to you, there's no such thing really as freedom of speech. It depends on who you're offending. If you're offending, for example, a certain segment of society in a way that's rude, then none of us want that freedom of speech. But when Moin Ali was asking to wear a wristband, that was seen as being wrong. But Harry Kane wearing an armband, who dared question? On that matter, for Harry Kane, why would you want to turn up to a World Cup in a country where you feel that there is a particular worldview that doesn't suit yours? Why not boycott from the beginning? Even those commentators who had a problem at the beginning, why did you then turn up? Why don't you boycott? There were many who boycotted South Africa for years because of apartheid. Many who saw the plight of Nelson Mandela. But all of a sudden, everyone was turning up. Nobody was forcing you to turn up to this World Cup. If you felt that this was a country that had blatant human rights abuses, and the country where you live or their allies don't have any whatsoever, you got to wake up and smell the coffee. Because this is a country that's also worked its socks off to try and take in certain aspects of Western culture. The malls are welcoming designers from around the world. There are stores which are welcoming designers from around the world. There are hotel resorts where a person can go and literally see a number of the most famous restaurants in the world. Even the princesses of the Qatari royal family, if a person looks at, for example, Mayasa and Hind, these are two princesses of the Qatari royal family who have worked so hard to try and integrate their own culture with Western culture. It's not surprising to see Hind walking in the streets of Monaco or organizing an event there, and nor is it surprising to see Mayasa at the same time working hard, for example, at ensuring that there are aspects of Qatari culture that can be seen worldwide, even if that means you have to go to the Met Museum in New York. There are these princesses who are across the Middle East. A person could go to Rania of Jordan, a person could go to Moza in Qatar, a person can go to other princesses in the Middle East who have continuously tried to find a balance between Western and Eastern culture. But they have their own culture. And when someone has their own culture, your moral compass is not meant to bully those people into feeling that they are wrong. Because the clamor in relation to Qatar's worldview on certain issues in relation to morality was unbelievable. Let's look at them actually one by one. The first one, LGBT. We need to understand that when we're looking at the moral compass of the world that we live in, it is either a God-centric culture or a material-centric culture. God-centric culture is that where the moral compass is seen as being guided by one's primordial nature, what we call one's fitrah, and also guided by revelation. Revelation, which has come to us from the heavens, is that revelation which we believe to be the word of God. Judaism, Christianity, Islam are known as the Abrahamic faiths. When you have therefore a moral compass, that moral compass of a God-centric culture is one which is dictated to by the heavens in what is known as revelation. That God-centric worldview provides a moral compass on many different issues. It provides a moral compass in relation to gender. It provides a moral compass in relation to race. It provides a moral compass in relation to sexual habits, in relation to habits of hygiene and food. A God-centric worldview is one that relies on revelation to allow us to understand how morality could be guided. Innately within our life, we have a moral compass which God, in the God-centric worldview, has instilled with us as human beings. The Quran discusses the fact that our soul is inspired to a level where it can differentiate between right and wrong. In that God-centric worldview, therefore, there are stories of prophets of God. And from those stories of those prophets of God, we develop a worldview and a moral compass. And that permeates within our societies to different levels. Some which go all the way to being called Islamic states, others which have an Islamic undertone, but where people are respected of different faiths and beliefs, and may even lean to, in some cases, Muslim majority countries, with a secular worldview. A material-centric society is one that believes in an empirical worldview. That which can be judged by the senses is that which can be believed in, and that which really can't be tested in a science lab is that which should be rejected. We got no problem with that whatsoever. But a science lab doesn't really provide me with a moral worldview. I can't test morality in a test tube. So I test morality in a material-centric worldview through my own whims and desires. What is it exactly that I'm believing at this particular moment in my life is my moral worldview, is my moral compass. Now, we got no problem with that. But when you're looking at society now, Western society is very much material-centric. The Middle East is still very much God-centric. But the Middle East, there are countries that differ with one another as to how much of that God-centricity permeates into society. But that still has a major effect on culture. Now, I'm not going to deny between God-centricity and material-centricity, there are shades of grey. There are certain religions that may be God-centric, but are a bit confused as to what their perceptions are or what their conceptions are regarding gender, sexuality, race, and so on and so forth. When the Qatari royal family members and the organizer of the World Cup was continuously being asked the question that what is your opinion about LGBT? What is your opinion about those of a particular orientation who want to come and visit the World Cup and come and witness the greatest spectacle in the world? He said everybody is welcome. There's no problem. But at the same time, when we travel to your country, we respect your culture. And when you come to our country, respect our culture. If there's certain things we can agree to disagree, I'm sure there are certain things in the material worldview which differ from certain things in the God-centric worldview. When therefore Qatar has a particular opinion about LGBT, this opinion is because it's got a God-centric undertone to its society. It's because the people who are the members of the Qatari, for example, country, or those within the Middle East, still take a lot of their moral compass from where? From the Quran. Islam is a religion that prohibits homosexuality. One may argue that even within Islam, there isn't a belief that a person is gay or lesbian. Again, if we're talking freedom of speech and everyone's allowed to have freedom of speech, so let us have our freedom of speech. In Islam, this idea of gay and lesbian does not exist. In Islam, we have male and female. And a male and female have a particular moral compass prescribed to them by the Lord as to the way they live their life. There are certain boundaries within which they live, and if they transgress those boundaries, then that is seen as a sin. Islam, therefore, is very similar to Judaism, in that Islam and Judaism are religions with a God-centric worldview which prohibits homosexuality. But that does not mean that as a Muslim, I go around making homophobic comments. That does not mean as a Muslim, I raise my family to have slurs and disrespect and abuse towards people because of their orientation. People go through different peaks and troughs in their life, different trials and challenges in their life. And at the end of the day, when I live, for example, in the UK, I'm proud to live in a country where there is tolerance of certain ideas, but nobody's forced to accept certain ideas. People are allowed to discuss. But when I go to the Middle East, I recognize that if I go on holiday to Dubai, there are certain things that I cannot do in that culture, which I may be able to do in Western culture. I respect the laws of that land, and I know very well that in that land, my sister can walk around on the streets, can walk in Sheikh Zayed Road at 3 a.m., go and pick up a McD's, or a KFC, or a Hardee's without being harassed. So I appreciate why that culture has certain guidelines. When Harry Kane wants to wear a rainbow armband, you can keep that to the UK. You don't need to come and bring it over here. I respect Hugo Lloris. They both play for the same football club. But the difference is that Hugo Lloris wanted to make clear that this isn't the place for us to come and discuss politics. And we have to respect other people's cultures. The German national team wants to suddenly become freedom fighters and wants to speak out against oppression. But I'm sure there are other countries, Germany and your national team, can speak out against their oppression. I'm surprised that all of a sudden 11 football players decided that this is where they're going to speak out against the oppression of a certain community. We don't like to see anyone oppressed, discriminated against, or hurt in any way whatsoever, physically or emotionally. But at the same time, when it comes to the World Cup, that's not the place to come and bring these discussions. My God-centric culture, therefore, prohibits what you find as absolutely normal. And that continues into other acts as well. Alcohol, God-centric culture in Islam prohibits alcohol. Do Muslims drink? You'll find Muslims who drink. Don't worry about that. Do Muslims engage in a number of other acts? Yes. But Islam as a religion prohibits an act like drinking alcohol. You may, for example, in your culture, be proud that you can't remember what happened last night. You may actually be proud of that. You may be proud of other things in your culture as well, which the Qatari is not necessarily proud of. You may be happy if your dog licks your face for 5 minutes in a row. That's not necessarily part of a God-centric culture. You may also be happy giving many different pronouns or saying that there are many different genders. We'll stick to male and female. You may also be happy sending your parents to hospices and visiting them once in a while. We may differ with that. So when alcohol is prohibited by Qatar, all of a sudden there are people screaming, Qatar, alcohol, no alcohol. Relax. You are a human being. A few weeks away from an intoxicant may be good for you. It may reduce physical abuse. It may reduce certain sexual abuse. It may also reduce some of the worst behavior that you see Friday and Saturday nights. When people now were saying that England fans got into no trouble in Qatar, why was this a major headline? Because England fans in the past, in some cases, were seen as being the hooligans of the World Cup. Were always seen as being the troublemakers of the World Cup. Were always seen as being the most troublesome. But the solution was so easy. No alcohol. Why do you think when I go to watch Liverpool Football Club, there's one match in particular that they always decide to try and make it an early kickoff, and that's Liverpool versus United. The earlier the kickoff, the less chance of having drinks before a game. Do you know how many people had their head smashed open because they've drunk before a game and they just start looking for others? And you know the worst thing about alcohol? It allows the human being to reveal their true opinion about others. The second worst thing about alcohol is that you feel less guilty when you sin, especially those sins you've always wanted to do. That same person that you see from 9 to 5 acting mature and decent, watch them 7 hours later on a Friday night. And then you won't believe that that was the same person dealing with your inquiry at the office earlier in the day. But for us, in Muslim majority countries, that's why alcohol is prohibited. And we're not the only ones. Let's not forget that in football stadiums in France since 1991, it's not like people were taking their drink everywhere around the stadium. No, Qatar is the one that has to be attacked. Why? Because all of our focus will be on who? Will be on Qatar. All of our focus will be on lack of alcohol in Qatar. Why don't you bring that same focus into French football stadiums and discuss the law since 1991 that is talking more about the dry area than allowing people to just pick up drinks and continue to drink throughout a game? So therefore, when this issue of alcohol emerges, you have your culture and the Qatari people have their culture as well. But to come and try and dictate to them that if you don't accept LGBT and you don't accept me flying a rainbow flag, you've got more than enough time on Sky Sports every single day to continue to look for the first football player who will come out. You could do that in your country. You can make it the main headline every day, and you can make Jordan Henderson wear shoelaces and armbands all day in the West. There's no problem. You can have rainbow, you can even have a grass pitch that's rainbow if you want. And you can have the whole stadium rainbow, and you can even have people tattooed with rainbows. You could do whatever you want in a Western country. There's no harm. That's your democracy. And in some cases in those Western countries, they've not recovered from medieval Europe, and therefore secularism for them is a breath of fresh air. I can appreciate that. But also appreciate that people in other cultures have a different culture from your culture. And that you cannot come around as a moral police and dictate to everybody, as Jürgen Klinsmann tried to somehow ensue when he was attacking Carlos Queiroz and the Iranian national team. Now we got to give props to the Iranian national team because they came into the World Cup in absolute baffled land. They've got their issues back home, and those players were trying their hardest. And I do believe that sometimes there is an arrogance which is shown to countries like Iran, or a lack of warmth. What was nice, however, were the embraces that took place throughout this World Cup. We're days away from the final. I still think that we're going to see more embraces. But it was nice to see the Iranian players and the American players embrace with one another. And hopefully a brighter future can be seen between these countries, because it's so sad that outside of the football pitch, Iran and USA can't compete and then still smile at the end. It was nice to see Macron as well coming towards the Moroccan national team and embracing them and hugging them. And maybe that tension between the French and the North Africans and the right wing within French society can also ease a little bit. The Moroccan national team, without a doubt, have been a blessing. And they've been a blessing for a number of different reasons. The first reason I must say that they were a blessing is that the veiling of the Muslim female has been constantly criticized in our societies. And we see in Iran the criticism that takes place, that what is this veil, this is backwards, archaic, don't force it, and so on and so forth. And people have their opinions and they have their rights to their opinions. But isn't it great when you see Ashraf Hakimi celebrating with his mom and his mom's wearing a veil? Or you see Hakim Ziyech with his mom and his mom wearing a veil. I think Ashraf Hakimi and Hakim Ziyech are two football players who are probably earning £250,000 a week. Makes no difference when it comes to their mom. For their mom, the veil is beautiful. And I think that there are many ladies who went to Qatar this year and felt, you know what? Might not wear a veil. There's quite a bit of respect in this country towards us. There are others who may have seen disrespect shown to them in the past, but for these, they've seen ladies in hijab. I saw a scene from Thumama, and I have a soft spot for that area, where they were giving out sweets to people who are walking towards the stadium. And you see these young girls and they're veiled. And in the eyes of many, the veiled young Muslim girl who needs emancipation, and she is a slave and she has no rights. Well, Ashraf Hakimi's mother had no issues whatsoever. And nor did Hakim Ziyech. And nor did the others. But secondly, the embrace of the mother. As we see the traditions that say heaven lies underneath the feet of the mother, from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family. And when we see those traditions what do we notice with them? That ultimately, your mom's not someone that you throw in a hospice or a care home and say to them, look after her. Rather, our mothers are the basis of our success. For those of you listening, Imam Zayn al-Abidin, alayhi salam, the great grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon his family, within his treatise of rights, available online, known as Risalat al-Huquq, he has a discussion about the rights of the mother. And in that discussion, he makes it clear that you should never neglect the right of your mother. She carried you where no one else carried you, and she fed you from the fruit of her heart. She didn't mind being awake as long as you slept. She didn't mind that you were in the shade and she was in the heat. She didn't mind that she went thirsty as long as you drank, or she went hungry as long as you ate. We can never be those who show enough gratefulness to our mother except with the help of God. And that's what's so beautiful about those embraces with their mothers. They weren't embarrassed from embracing their moms. Our culture is a culture that doesn't have a problem hugging your mom. I've seen certain cultures, and I'm not going to generalize and say all Western culture, because I've got a lot of friends who come from Western society, and when they see their moms, they love to hug and kiss their moms. But there are some also, when they see their dads, it's just a handshake. Hey, how are you? He meets him at an airport, having not seen him for months, and shakes his hand, says, hey, how are you? Whereas, you know, with us, Arabs especially, we're going to hug and scream and shout when we haven't even seen each other for a couple of weeks. But also the beauty of the Moroccan national team was prostrating at all times. Winning or losing, ultimately, what is prostration? Number one, removes arrogance from me. 11 wealthy football players. But Mohamed Salah and Sadio Mane had set the precedent with Liverpool Football Club. And that precedent was, as wealthy as we become, as many trophies that we win, we're still going to prostrate to God and thank God for everything in our life. Again, a God-centric society brings about a moral compass where ultimately perfection lies in submission to God and perfection lies in humility before God. Sadio Mane and Mohamed Salah had highlighted you could play for the best football club in the world and you could win absolutely everything, but you could, at the end, also be somebody who doesn't give the manager too many headaches. You ever see Mohamed Salah and Sadio Mane clubbing? Do they come back drunk? Do they get themselves involved in political issues left, right and center? No, I think Jurgen Klopp will be the first to admit that those Germans in the World Cup team should maybe go and sit with Jurgen Klopp and ask him, how do the Muslims behave? And what's the morality like of the likes of Mohamed Salah, Sadio Mane, Ibou Konate, and a shout out to Ibou Konate for Sunday. When we therefore look at it, what do we see? Prostration. They lost. Prostration. You win. Prostration. It's the beauty of prostration. I put my forehead on the earth because I know that I was someone who came from earth and one day I'll return 6 feet under. So I might as well get used to that and humble myself. In the eyes of many, when you look at somebody put their head on the earth, you think to yourself, how low? In the eyes of God, they are the highest. And therefore, when you saw the Moroccan national team, you saw in one moment as if they were supported by the whole world. And they went and they tried their hardest and they never gave up. And it galvanized the country and maybe galvanized the religion. And maybe also was what the Qatari World Cup deserved. That if people didn't appreciate the hard work that Qatar had put in, they should appreciate that these are the types of people who can work hand in hand to highlight to us how we can return to our morality and our original nature. It's been a brilliant World Cup and it's brought about a lot of discussions. And I sincerely hope that those who've been to Qatar can come back and tell others that, you know what, an Islam-centric society is not that bad. A God-centric society is not that bad. There are positives in Qatar, and there may be negatives, but name me a country in the world that doesn't have negatives. Everybody should strive to work with one another. And the whole aim should be that when this World Cup is over, you're going to have a Muslim present a trophy to non-Muslims. But that what united them was the love of what could be argued to be the biggest religion in the world, and that is football. Football can unite all of us and should really be bringing a smile on all of our faces. I thank you all for listening. Don't forget me in your prayers, and good luck to France and Argentina in the final in a couple of days. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. "11 years of war have inflicted immense suffering on the Syrian people. My first experience with Syria was in the mid-80s, but they were only very few childhood memories. Ayatollah Sistani is born in the holy city of Mashhad. And where better to begin the journey in gaining knowledge than in the vicinity of Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida alayhi salam. When the flames of sectarianism were lit by ISIS, he remained calm.
ISIS is not really a threat in Iraq in the same way, and a lot of that is down to his mobilization.
Qom remained of the utmost importance in his heart. Not only does he study here, but he ends up leaving a legacy behind that will continue to serve generation after generation. It was Ayatollah Sistani who had the huge honor of leading his funeral prayer.
He doesn't need to have a Twitter account. He doesn't need to have a YouTube channel to link himself to his followers.
This meeting with the Pope was a gesture on a completely different level of reality. The Pope himself said, "I have met a man of faith, a man of humility, and a man of God."